I have asked Karen to lead us off with our land acknowledgement today. Karen.
Okay, thanks, Letitia. So in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, the Calgary Adapted Hub powered by Jumpstart gratefully acknowledges that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation Region 3. In the spirit of reconciliation and the responsibility that we all hold in the sport and recreation sector, we encourage all of you joining us today and committing to the Truth and Reconciliation Act's calls to action, numbers 87 to 91. And I'll pop the link in the chat. I think it's always great for us to continue to go back and revisit this and remind ourselves of our responsibility, our collective responsibility to ensure that we're creating safe and inclusive spaces and environments where everyone feels welcomed and belonged. And I certainly hope that we've created that welcoming and inclusive space here today. And certainly thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome to our November edition of the Calgary Adapted Hub Research and Community Engagement Seminar. So we have a two-part seminar today where we're going to lead off with Catherine. Catherine is a graduate student at the University of Calgary, completing her master's degree with the Byridell Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Program. The focus of her research is to better understand effective strategies for improving physical activity levels in children living with a physical disability. In alignment with adapted sports, Catherine has volunteered in a variety of youth and sport settings, from coaching girls basketball to pioneering a dryland physical literacy program for youth with disabilities to teaching swim lessons and lifeguarding. Being active has always been a priority for her, and she aims to increase opportunities to be active for all youth with physical disabilities. Catherine, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay, so thank you, Letitia, for the introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Catherine. I am a master's student at the University of Calgary, and my area of interest is looking at adapted sports, so ways to increase participation and activity for children with physical disabilities. What do we know about adapted sport? We actually know a lot. We know that at the population level, about 10% of Canadian youth are living with a disability, and about 15% of the world population. We also know that regular participation in physical activity is a preventative measure towards the development of secondary diseases and negative health outcomes, which include but aren't limited to depression, obesity, and diabetes. And this is the benefits are the greatest when individuals are meeting the recommended guidelines. And for children with disabilities, it is 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day. In a systematic review by Shields, Sinnott, and Barr, they revealed the different barriers to lifelong participation in physical activities for those with disabilities. And that includes policy and program, environmental, social, and individual barriers. We also know that it's important to consider psychosocial considerations when promoting physical activity participation. And so these include looking at attraction to physical activity levels and self-competence. It was cited in the literature that an important difference between individuals that participate and those that drop out of youth sport may be their level of perceived competence. And lastly, we also know that physical activity levels are lacking in the general population. In a study by Moore et al. In 2020, so this is during COVID, they found that 23.8% of those ages 5 to 11 years and 13% ages 12 to 18 years of typically developing children were meeting the guidelines, and even less, 5.3% of youth living with a physical disability. Again, this is during COVID. I thought it was very relevant today's talk, were meeting the guidelines. So again, a very, very small chunk. And when you consider the benefits of regular participation, this is very problematic, and we need to look at ways to change this. Ethics was submitted prior to data collection in August 2019. We collected parental consent forms and youth asset forms for those ages 7 to 14 years, and those between 15 to 18 years provided consent forms. All the data is de-identified and stored on a secure server. What is the purpose of my study? So the purpose of my study was to examine changes in weekly levels to moderate to vigorous physical activity and self-perception and attraction to physical activity in youth with physical disability during and at 6 and 12 months following participation in a 5-day adapted sport and recreation camp. This is the poster that was provided to promote the camp back in 2019. And we used a pre-experimental study design that sought to recruit up to 48 participants enrolled in an adapted sport and recreation camp using a convenience sample. This is the same camp that was used in Jessica's study, who will be presenting next. So I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the details of it so she doesn't have to in 20 minutes. So 2 week-long adapted sport and recreation camps were offered through Active Living and the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Calgary, and this was done in alignment with the Viradel Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Program. The first camp included adolescent participants ages 12 to 18 years, and the second camp was for those ages 7 to 12 years. The camp ran Monday to Friday from 9 to 4. The cost to participate in the camp was $350, although that was subsidized through Kids Sport Canada, the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation, and an anonymous donor to remove cost as a barrier to participation to those that qualified. Both the camps introduced participants to adapted sport and recreation activities through existing adapted community programs available in Calgary and the area. Activities offered included karate, fencing, cycling, swimming, gymnastics, wheelchair sports, climbing, and sledge hockey. Additional activities introduced in alignment with existing Active Living mini youth summer camp activities are also included. And so that includes Lego, art, active gamers, health and wellness. Individuals were eligible to participate if they met the following inclusion criteria. And so that being between the ages of 7 to 18 years, having a physical disability, being able to move independently, whether that be ambulatory or with a manual wheelchair, and if they could direct assistance to daytime needs, including feeding or toileting. They were excluded if they were unable to follow directions in a 1 to 3 staff to youth setting. Actigraphy was used as part of this research program. And what is actigraphy? Actigraphy is the use of a small device called an actigraph, which is used to objectively measure moderate to vigorous physical activity. It has been shown to be valid and reliable in this population. Participants were asked to wear the devices continuously, removing them only when getting wet or if they were causing discomfort. Movement limitations were also present in the dominant wrist, causing participants to favor their dominant wrists. As such, we asked the participants to place their device on their dominant wrist. And this was to pick up activity counts for both wheelchair users and non-wheelchair users. The Chandler algorithm was used to determine the cut points to describe activity intensity, such as sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous. One of the questionnaires that was used is the self-perception profile in children by Harder. Participants pick one of 2 alternative statements and then indicate whether the statement is really true or sort of true for them. Scores can vary from 1 to 4 for each subdomain. The lower the score, the more negative perception of confidence. This tool has been shown to be appropriate to use with children with and without disabilities. Self-perceptions and motivations for physical activity have been evaluated through validated questionnaires in a variety of contexts, such as this one, and it is relevant for children at this stage of development. It includes one's self-perception in 5 specific different subdomains, including physical self-worth, athletic competence, scholastic competence, behavioral conduct, and social competence, as well as a separate global self-worth subscale. Scholastic competence and behavioral conduct were not used in this, or were not evaluated during this camp, as these measures were not relevant to the research questions. The global self-worth domain evaluates agreements with statements about the general perception of oneself with no mention of specific skills or abilities. How much a person likes themselves overall as a human being. It's its own separate score, and it's not found by summing of competencies. An example statement is, some kids are often unhappy with themselves, but other kids are pretty pleased with themselves. Physical self-worth describes the extent to which one likes their physical appearance. Example, their weight, their hair, their face. An example statement is, some kids are happy with the way they look, but other kids are not happy with the way they look. Athletic competency reflects one's ability to be good at sports by asking about agreement to statements like, some kids do very well at all kinds of sports, but other kids don't feel that they are very good when it comes to sports. And lastly, social competency refers to one's ability to make friends, have others like you, and etc., with statements such as, some kids find it hard to make friends, but other kids find it's pretty easy to make friends. The next questionnaire used is the Children's Attraction to Physical Activity, the CAPA scale by Bristad. It is a questionnaire developed to examine children's feelings towards engaging in activity, games, and sport involving movement and physical exertion. The questionnaire comprises 5 subscales. The first 4 relate to the enjoyment of fun elements they relate to enjoyment and fun elements of children's attraction to physical activity. They are liking of games and sport, liking of physical exertion and exercise, liking of vigorous activity, and peer acceptance in game sports. The last subscale, importance of exercise, focuses on the thoughts related to children's attraction to physical activity for health benefits. Data was collected at 4 different time points. When looking at actigraphy only, that was done for 7 consecutive days between April and August of 2019 for the pre-camp measures. It was again done during camps through days 1 to 5, so only 5 consecutive days. And then the 6 months post-camp occurred right before COVID happened, so in February to March 2020, and that was done for 7 consecutive days. And then the 12 months post-camp was done in September to October of 2020, again for 7 consecutive days. The questionnaires were submitted or were evaluated on day 1 for pre-camp. They were done on day 3 for the during camp, and then at the same time as the actigraphy post-camp. Baseline characteristics describing age, sex, weight, and disability type are presented. And our primary analysis looked at moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so we present the median time and range spent in MVPA at different time points. And we examine the differences between these time points using a Wilcox and signed rank test. The secondary analysis looked at the questionnaires. Again, we presented median scores and range and examined the differences between time points for adolescents only using a Wilcox and signed rank test. So Karen, this is your cue. These results are preliminary and unpublished, so I'll ask them to start recording again. So this project sought to increase long-term participation in physical activity in youth living with a physical disability by introducing them to local adapted sport organizations, but it was unsuccessful. It is widely accepted that regular participation in physical activity is a preventative tool to the development of certain chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, to name a few. Physical activity can also be preventative against the development of mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression. The 5-day adapted sport and recreation camp saw an increase in daily time spent in MVPA compared to pre-camp MVPA. However, it was not sustained following camp for adolescent camp group or the children camp group, looking at 6 months to pre-camp. The change from pre-camp to 12 months post-camp was not significant in the adolescent group, but it was significantly higher in the children camp group, bearing in mind the small sample size that we had. According to Zhang et al. In 2018, time spent in MVPA differs between youth with and without physical disabilities and was a function of age, but not type of disability. And we did find that the younger camp group had consistently had higher levels of MVPA than their adolescent peers. There is also a need for studies seeking to increase time spent in activity in youth with a physical disability to have longer follow-up periods following an intervention to determine whether changes acquired are sustained. And this study fills the gap by including 2 long-term follow-up periods at 6 and 12 months following the intervention. To our knowledge, this is the first study to evaluate the impact of a 5-day adapted sport and recreation camp on participant levels, on participant self-perceptions and attraction to physical activity before, during, and after participation in the camp. In this study, we aim to examine the self-perceptions and attraction to physical activity at 4 time points. And overall, there was no evidence of change in self-perceptions and attraction to physical activity. So median global self-worth scores did not change relative to day 1 of camp data, during camp, 6 months post-camp, or 12 months post-camp. They did, however, consistently have high median scores above 3 out of a possible 4, which represent positive perceived global self-worth. This finding is in line with the study by Shields et al. In 2007, where the children with cerebral palsy had a mean score of 3.35 of a possible 4. And so this suggests that youth with a physical disability may not have lower levels of perceived global self-worth when compared to their typically developing peers. Furthermore, adolescents consistently ranked global self-worth as higher than the self-concept subdomains at all time points. In a study by Zibel et al. In 2009, they used an exploratory matched pair for sex and age study with 9 pairs of youth aged 7 to 11 years with and without cerebral palsy. And they found that those with cerebral palsy had lower levels of perceived physical self-worth than those without cerebral palsy. So although this wasn't a statistically significant finding, it was clinically important. They defined it by being a change of 0.5 points or greater on the 4-point scale. Our sample at 12 months post-camp was lower than the mean by Zibel, and so this finding could imply that lower levels of perceived physical competence are an important consideration as to why youth with a physical disability are less likely to continue being active. Athletic competence scores are slightly higher than those found in the Zibel study that I cited just now. Participants with cerebral palsy had a mean score of 2.5, and that was 1 point lower than their typically developing counterparts. In the same study I mentioned by Shields in 2007, their reports were similar to that of Zibel with a mean score of 2.46 for those with cerebral palsy and 2.97 for those without impairments. And so these scores could be a result of children with physical disabilities having realistic self-perceptions in their athletic abilities. There was another study by Winnick and Spencer Cavalier in 2013, and they looked at sledge hockey. They found that the accessible nature of the sport made participation more enjoyable. So certain social pressures that may be present when participating with able-bodied individuals can be alleviated by creating a space for individuals with physical disabilities. This further reinforces the importance of offering disability-specific programs for youth with disabilities to participate. Lack of friends has been cited as a social barrier to participation in physical activity for individual disabilities. And so having disability-specific programs reduces social pressures that exist when participating amongst able-bodied individuals, thus facilitating the establishment of friendships with teammates and creating a sense of belonging. Lastly, in 2006, Martin suggested that positive experiences which lead to enjoyment that arise from participation in disability sport are critical for developing long-term sport commitment. Furthermore, Paxton et al. In 2004 reported that the relationship between physical competence and physical activity is mediated by attraction to physical activity. And so this indicates that sport mastery may not be enough to create lifelong participation in physical activity. However, providing an enjoyable experience for everyone may be the key to creating sustained participation in physical activity in youth with physical disabilities. Looking at future studies, so future studies should consider a larger sample, a control group for comparison, and ways to improve psychosocial aspects when planning an adapted sport and recreation camps for youth with physical disabilities. There are a few strengths to my studies, and so one of them is the long-term follow-up period of 6 and 12 months following the intervention. The use of actigraphy is an objective measure of moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is more reliable and more valid than self-reported measures. And the study included 3 camp staff with a physical disability, and activities were often delivered by community partners living with a physical disability. By creating a space for individuals with physical disability, certain social pressures that may be present when participating with able-bodied individuals may be alleviated, making participation in sport more enjoyable. And the study is not without limitations. And so this study focused on youth with physical disabilities that had the cognitive function to understand instructions. And so this might not be generalizable to all youths with physical disabilities, depending on their comorbidities. In addition, the convenient sample creates a risk of selection bias. So it is possible that those that signed up to participate in the camp already have higher levels of physical activity compared to their peers, which could lead to an overestimation of time spent in MVPA. The study also has a small sample size, no control group, and suffered from attrition. I would like to acknowledge my supervisors and my committee, Drs. Carolyn Emery, Elizabeth Conliffe, Megan McDonough, Jonathan Smurl, and David Legg, as well as Leticia Jansen, Liza Sandron, and Shane Eso for their help during this for this project. And we also acknowledge the support of the Varadel Pediatric Rehabilitation and Research Program, the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute, Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation, and Active Living, Faculty of Kinesiology. And of course, this research would not be possible without support of participants, their parents, and the experienced camp staff. Thank you, and I will now take any questions. Mark? Mark, did you have a question? Or it's in the chat? No?
Maybe I'll take the floor for a second if Mark doesn't have a question. Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation, and it's awesome that the camp was offered. So first of all, I just wanted to get an idea of what the camp looked like. So it's 5 days?
Yeah, so the camp was 5 days long, Monday to Friday. And so it ranged from about 9 to 4 each day. We had a block before, we had 2 blocks before lunch. And so we could get 2 different types of activities. And then we had lunch for an hour and then 2 more blocks for 2 more activities in the afternoon. And that structure followed for the 5 days. And so we had community partners. So if we had sledge hockey one morning, we had community partners from a sledge hockey program come in and bring the sleds and kind of help push the participants around on the ice and play with them. For swimming, we had a community partner come in and run the pool session for us. And so camp staff kind of acted as support, participating in the activities where it was needed to help increase participation from the participants, as well as provide any assistance to the community partners that were needed with equipment set up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So I'm just wondering if there are next steps to the study or the camp, and if so, then what they might be.
Yeah, we were hoping to run a camp in 2020. Unfortunately, that was for obvious reasons that couldn't happen. And so we did run another camp in 2021. This time it wasn't limited to those strictly with a physical disability. We allowed anybody with any type of disability to participate. The same requirements being that they had to be mobile independently, whether ambulatory or in a wheelchair. Yeah, we had some of the same community programs. We had a couple new activities, and I think we're on track to run it again in 2022.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Does anyone else have a question for Catherine?
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right, we're going to move over to our second presentation for tonight. We have Jessica as a PhD student at the University of Calgary in the Pediatric Onset of Neuromotor Impairments Lab. Jessica's master's thesis focused on family experiences regarding how adapted physical activity for children and adolescents living with a disability impacted their family relationships. Jessica has worked with individuals living with a disability in a variety of recreation contexts. Through this work, Jessica was able to see how adapted physical activity impacted not only the child living with a disability, but also their family members, which led to her being interested in researching this impact. Jessica?
All right, perfect. I will just share my screen. Oh. All right, so yeah, like Letitia said, I am Jessica Youngblood. I'll be presenting our work on family experiences following participation in an adapted physical activity camp. So families living with a child with a disability often experience additional barriers to accessing recreation programs, and parents often need to be more involved in planning and implementing activities for their child's daily life and also their physical activity programs. So these families face a lot of barriers, whether it's their child's educational needs, medical needs. The families and parents typically need to advocate more for their child's participation in just everyday activities. So finding appropriate recreation programs for a child living with a disability can be particularly exhausting, and sometimes is an extra barrier that families just aren't able to do because it requires so much research to find these programs that are appropriate for their child living with a disability. So because our society rarely adjusts to the impairments of individuals with a disability, there's limited spaces and opportunities for physical activity participation. So this difficulty to find appropriate recreation for children with a disability can be challenging to deal with and may put strain on families and family relationships. And further, negative parental perceptions have been associated as a barrier to physical activity participation. Therefore, it's important for parents to see the positive outcomes of their child living with a disability after participating in physical activity, and to reduce the challenges parents face in helping their child be involved in physical activity. So adapted physical activity programs can help address some of these challenges and create opportunities for physical activity participation with children living with a disability. But there's limited research that looks at families' perspectives on how programs affect their families. So we know there's tons of physical and psychosocial benefits for children and adolescents with disabilities from participating in physical activity, but there's little research that looks at how do these benefits go further and impact the child's daily life or activities or their families. So the purpose of this research was to better understand family members' perspectives regarding family relationships as they relate to participation in an adapted summer camp for children and adolescents living with a disability. So we conducted 2 studies looking at 2 different camp environments. So the first camp was the camp that Kat just told us about, so a day camp for children and adolescents living with a disability. And then the second camp that I looked at was a family camp where families had the opportunity to participate in physical activity alongside their child living with a disability. So throughout the presentation, you'll notice I typically just say child when I'm talking about the child or adolescent living with a disability, just because that's their context within their family unit. They are a child within their family. So that's typically how I will talk about them. And then, so these studies looked at 2 research questions. The first one being how family members' perceptions of family relationships are affected following participation in an adapted physical activity camp, and what are families' experiences regarding family relationships after losing the opportunity to participate in adapted physical activity camps due to COVID-19. So since we conducted this study in 2020, we thought it was really important to look at not only how going to these camps impacted families, but also how losing the opportunity to participate and to attend these camps impacted the families. So we conducted 2 case studies where we examined these 2 different camp environments, like I mentioned. So the one program that was examined was Rocky Mountain Adaptive's Friends and Family Camp. So this was a week-long camp where families had the opportunity to participate in a variety of outdoor recreation opportunities alongside their child living with a disability. The families who attended this camp participated in a wide variety of outdoor activities, including hiking, biking, and kayaking. And the aim of this camp was to give family members the opportunity to participate in outdoor activities with their child living with a disability. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to this camp as the family camp.
And then the other camp that we examined was the Adaptive Sport and Recreation Summer Camp that was conducted through Active Living in the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Calgary. So this is the camp that Kat just talked about and just shared all about. So the goal of this camp was just to increase long-term engagement in physical activity for children and adolescents living with a disability. And throughout the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to it as the youth camp. So there were 5 families who participated in the family camp study and 11 families who participated in the youth camp study. So in total, we had 16 families who participated between the 2 studies, and this included 17 children living with a disability, 16 mothers, 6 fathers, and 9 siblings. The children and adolescents living with a disability were 10 to 17 years old at the time of camp participation. So we conducted focus groups with each family at one time point via Zoom, and the data was analyzed through thematic analysis. So the ways in which family members experience changes in their perspectives, conversations surrounding disability, parental worry, and pride in the child living with a disability were all important to the ways in which they interacted and understood each other. And then further, the confidence and independence experienced by the child living with a disability was meaningful to not only their own experience, but also to the interactions within their families. So there's kind of 2 things I really like to pull out from these findings and from what we saw. So I think that confidence and independence piece was really important to the family's experiences and to how they interacted with one another. And then also that decrease in parental stress was a really important aspect to these findings. So low self-confidence has been cited as a barrier to physical activity participation for children and adolescents living with a disability. And individuals, so it's really important that we can talk about that confidence can be obtained from going to these camps, that confidence can have such a big impact on families and family relationships. And also individuals living with a disability may be viewed as being limited in their abilities to be independent because they may rely more on their family members to help them in daily tasks and to facilitate this physical activity involvement. So I think that independence piece and that they did find more independence through these camp experiences is a really important thing to note and point out that we found through these studies. And then also research shows that families raising a child living with a disability tend to face higher levels of stress when finding recreation programs. So in part, this is because parents worry that programs will not accommodate for their child's disability. So I think it's so important that we saw in both studies that decrease in parental stress and how that really did impact the families and family relationships. So future research should continue to examine how physical activity for children and youth living with a disability can impact family life by engaging community partners to offer developmentally enhancing programs for children living with a disability. So there were some limitations to these studies. So since the camps were suspended in 2020, focus groups were conducted over a year after camp participation. So this may have impacted the participants' abilities to recall certain details. And then it was also necessary to conduct all focus groups via Zoom rather than in person, which may have made it more challenging to establish rapport with the participants. Also, I acknowledge that the families who volunteered to participate in this study may have been more likely to have a positive experience at the camp than those who did not. So we might not be getting the full experience of families and the full range of experiences. So now the practical implications. Why are these results important? How can we use these moving forward in physical activity programming? So the findings of these studies suggest that there may be positive implications for family interactions and relationships associated with participation in adapted physical activity camps. So the findings from this research can be used to enhance adapted physical activity programming, to consider the experiences of families and draw attention to how those experiences may be relevant to family relationships. So for example, programs that incorporate the entire family in recreation opportunities can tailor their activities to allow for time for that family bonding, which may affect how families communicate and support each other. And then in both types of programs, it's really important to draw attention to the value of creating opportunities for the child living with a disability to demonstrate and experience independence. And because those experiences were so important for family relationships and for family interactions. So program practitioners should be aware of the role they play in alleviating family stress and reducing those structural barriers to physical activity for families with a child living with a disability. So I think it's really important that program practitioners know that they're impacting more than just the child who's participating in their programs. It's going further and impacting their families and having an impact on their family life and family relationships. So when coordinating adapted physical activity programs, practitioners can tell families that they may experience family bonding, a decrease in daily stressors, and confidence and independence in the child living with a disability. So I would like to thank the Viardel Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Program at the Alberta Children's Hospital for providing the funding for this study, and the University of Calgary and Rocky Mountain Adapted for allowing us to recruit participants from their programs and just for creating the amazing programs we were able to examine. And finally, I would like to extend my gratitude towards the participants who agreed to be in these studies. Thank you. I'll now take your questions at this time. Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I have a question for both of you, if I may.
Yeah.
So we're starting a camp from scratch at Mount Royal this coming summer. What are your words of advice for me if I wanted to make sure it was the best camp ever?
Kat, you can go first if you want.
Well, I would say take into consideration what it is that those participants want out of a camp, right? It's able-bodied, like we can, decide that we like camps done this way and do it, but that might not be the same way that your target audience might not want it. And then also, I think it's really important to consider those psychosocial considerations I mentioned. So attraction to physical activity and having activities that promote higher levels of self-competence, perceived self-competence.
Yeah, I just think, I think a big thing is making parents feel comfortable. That was a big thing that we saw from both studies, is that the parents felt comfortable in the programs and that they felt like their child would be safe, and that decrease in parental stress was so important. So just making sure the parents know how the practitioners were trained and how the staff were trained. I think that's all really important. And I think just giving that chance for the independence for the child living with a disability is also really important to their experience and their family's experiences overall.
Thank you. And by the way, to the two of you, those are both outstanding presentations. And the majority of people that we've had present on these seminars have been seasoned pros, like seasoned veterans in adaptive physical activity. So kudos to you. I'll stop now before my dog goes crazy.
Thank you, Brianne. I'll admit I watched your presentation again and took some notes on how to present it.
I agree. I totally echo what David just said. I thought you guys did a phenomenal job. I think that both of you guys have some really strong research with strong implications, and I'm excited to see you guys build off this. I think it has it will impact families greatly.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Catherine or Jessica?
Well, maybe just draw attention to the chat there that Jamie from Rocky Mountain Adaptive, he had to pop off, but he did leave a message in the chat there thanking both Jess and Catherine for the great presentations. And also a little plug for their programs that the winter season is officially upon us. If any families are looking to get involved with the Rocky Mountain Adaptive programs that Jess spoke about. And they're also looking for more staff and volunteers. So welcome people to follow up on those links that Jamie put in the chat.
Excellent. Well, then, in that case, we'll give everyone a couple minutes back. But before we do that, I would just like to say thank you to both Catherine and Jessica, really for wonderful presentations tonight, and to everyone else for joining us.